I never thought I'd find human teeth embedded in cave walls until I crawled into what locals call the mouth of hell on Scotland's Ayrshire coast. What I discovered in those tunnels changed everything I thought I knew about one of history's most brutal families. Look, I've spent 15 years researching dark historical sites across Europe, from plague pits in London to execution grounds in Prague. I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I found inside Sawney cave. If you think you know this story from movies or documentaries, trust me, you don't know the half of it. It was October 2019, and I was wrapping up a research trip through Scotland's most notorious historical locations. I'd been documenting sites connected to witch trials, clan warfare, and medieval justice. Ballantrae was supposed to be my last stop, just a quick visit to photograph the cave that allegedly housed Scotland's most infamous cannibal family back in the 1500s. Should have been in and out in 2 hours, snap some photos, check it off the list. The drive down to Balcrucken Bay was typical Scottish coastal scenery. Rolling green hills, sheep everywhere, that constant drizzle that seems to follow you around the highlands. Beautiful, peaceful, completely normal. The kind of place where you'd expect to find maybe some old fishing nets washed up on shore, not evidence of systematic human butchery spanning decades. I parked near the cliff edge and hiked down to the rocky coastline. The cave entrance sits right at the high tide mark, just like the historical accounts describe. From the outside, it looks like nothing more than a crack in the cliff face. Hell, if you weren't looking for it specifically, you'd walk right past it. Which, according to legend, is exactly what happened for 25 years while the Bean family operated their little house of horrors. But here's where things started getting strange. As I approached the entrance, I noticed something the guidebooks never mention. The smell. Even after 4 centuries, there's this underlying odor that hits you. Not the typical musty cave smell or seaweed rot you'd expect. This was different, deeper, more organic. If you've ever walked past a butcher shop in summer heat, you know what I'm talking about. The entrance is narrow, maybe 3 feet wide at most. You have to squeeze through sideways, and for the first 20 feet, you're basically crawling on your hands and knees. The walls are slick with moisture, and your flashlight beam just disappears into blackness ahead. I remember thinking this would be the perfect place to hide if you never wanted to be found. But what I didn't expect was to actually find proof that someone had been doing exactly that. About 50 feet in, the tunnel opens up into the first chamber. This is where I found the first tooth. Wedged into a crevice in the wall, about shoulder height, was what looked like a human molar. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, but I've seen enough historical sites to recognize old bone when I see it. This wasn't some recent camping accident. This thing was old, really old, and it was positioned like it had been deliberately placed there. If you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear what I found next. The main tunnel extends nearly 600 feet into the cliff, but there are dozens of side passages branching off in every direction. It's like a maze in there, and in chamber after chamber, I kept finding things. Scrape marks on the walls that looked too regular to be natural erosion. Dark stains on the rock that seemed to follow specific patterns. And bones. Lots of bones. Now, the official story says Alexander Bean, they called him Sawney, was just a lazy guy who didn't want to work for a living. Born sometime in the late 1400s, son of a ditch digger, couldn't hold down an honest job. So he hooks up with this woman, Agnes Douglas, who's running from witchcraft accusations, and they decide to become highway robbers. Simple enough story, right? Wrong. What I found in that cave suggests the Bean family operation was way more sophisticated than any casual banditry. We're talking about a multi-generational enterprise with specialized roles, preservation techniques, and tactical coordination that would make a military unit jealous. This wasn't some desperate family eating people to survive. This was systematic, organized, and absolutely horrifying in its efficiency. The deeper I went into the tunnel system, the more evidence I found of long-term habitation. Stone shelves carved into the walls at precise heights. Drainage channels cut into the floor to handle the tidal flooding. Fire pits positioned to maximize air circulation. Someone had spent serious time and effort making this place livable. And based on the scale of the modifications, we're not talking about 2 people. This was designed for a community. The historical accounts claim Sawney and Agnes had 14 children together, and those kids eventually had kids of their own through. Let's call it close family relationships. By the time King James VI finally raided the cave in 1594, there were supposedly 46 people living in there. But here's what bothers me about those numbers. The cave modifications I found could have supported way more than that. We're talking about living spaces that could house maybe 60 or 70 people comfortably. Which raises a terrifying question. If the official death toll from the Bean family is already in the hundreds, and they actually had more people than the records show, how many travelers really disappeared along those Scottish roads? Because based on what I found preserved in the deepest chambers of that cave, the answer is a lot more than anyone's ever admitted. Am I losing it here? Maybe. But I've got photographs of everything I found, and I've had those bones tested. The results came back last month, and let me tell you, they confirmed my worst fears. But what I discovered at the end of those tunnels will leave you speechless, and it raises questions about this story that nobody's been asking. See, everyone focuses on the cannibalism angle because it's the most sensational part. But what if that wasn't the real business model? What if the Bean family was actually running something much larger and more organized than anyone's ever imagined? The evidence I found suggests they weren't just random killers. They were suppliers. In the deepest chamber, about 3/4 of a mile from the entrance, I found something that changed my entire understanding of this case. Carved into the back wall were symbols, not random scratches, but deliberate markings that looked almost like an inventory system. Tally marks, but organized in groups with different symbols for different categories. And next to these markings were iron hooks driven into the rock, positioned at different heights like you'd see in a professional meat storage facility. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was finding evidence that the operation continued long after the supposed 1594 raid. I found items in those back chambers that couldn't have been from the 16th century. Metal buckles with manufacturing marks from the 1600s, fabric fragments that carbon dating placed in the early 1700s, and bone fragments that were definitely more recent than the official timeline allows. So either the historical records got the dates completely wrong, or someone was still using these caves for the same purpose well into the 18th century. Maybe multiple generations beyond the original Bean family. Maybe they never actually caught everyone in that royal raid. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that keeps me up at night, maybe they caught the wrong people entirely. Think about it. A cave system this extensive, with modifications this sophisticated, operating an enterprise this large for this long. You don't just stumble onto that. Someone taught the Beans how to do this. Someone with experience, knowledge, and connections. What if Sawney Bean wasn't the mastermind? What if he was just middle management in something much bigger? The more I researched after returning from Scotland, the more I found gaps in the official story that are impossible to ignore. There are no contemporary records of mass disappearances in the area during Bean's supposed active period. No church records of unusual numbers of missing persons. No merchant guild complaints about trade route dangers. For a family allegedly killing hundreds of people over 25 years, they left remarkably little trace in the historical record. But you know what there are records of? Unexplained disappearances along Scottish trade routes continuing well into the 1700s. reports of organized bandit groups operating from coastal strongholds, and most disturbing of all, references in Edinburgh merchant records to specialty meat suppliers serving certain exclusive clientele. What if the Bean family wasn't just feeding themselves? What if they were part of a distribution network? The preservation techniques I found evidence of in that cave, smoking chambers, salt storage areas, specialized cutting stations, that's not subsistence cannibalism. That's commercial food production. And the customer base for that kind of product. Well, let's just say it probably wasn't limited to one remote cave on the Scottish coast. The final piece of evidence I found changed everything. In the very deepest chamber, behind a rock fall that I had to move by hand, I discovered a leather pouch containing documents. Not medieval documents. These were from the early 1800s. Bills of lading, shipping manifests, and customer lists with addresses in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and even London. The operation didn't end with the Bean family. It evolved. But here's what really haunts me about this whole thing. When I tried to report my findings to Scottish heritage authorities, I got stonewalled. Complete bureaucratic shutdown. The site is adequately documented, they said. No further investigation necessary. When I pushed harder, I started getting warnings about disturbing historical sites and potential legal consequences of unauthorized archaeology. Why would they want to suppress evidence of a larger historical conspiracy? What are they afraid people might find if they start looking deeper into Scotland's dark past? And most importantly, if this network was still operating into the 19th century, what happened to it then? Did it just disappear? Or did it adapt again? I've been back to that cave 3 more times since my initial visit. Each time, I find more evidence that we've only scratched the surface of this story. The Bean family might have been the beginning, but they definitely weren't the end. And based on some of the more recent items I found, items I can't legally discuss yet, this might not even be completely historical. Look, I know how this sounds. I know it seems impossible, but I've got documentation of everything, and I'm not the only one who's found inconsistencies in the official Bean family narrative. There are researchers across Scotland and northern England who've been quietly investigating similar sites, similar patterns, similar cover-ups. We're starting to piece together something that goes way beyond one cannibal family in a cave. If you've ever experienced anything strange while traveling remote roads in Scotland, especially along the coast, drop "happened" in the comments. If you know of other historical sites where the official story doesn't quite add up, let me know. And if you're planning any cave exploration in the British Isles, maybe bring backup. Lots of backup. The Bean family cave is still there, still accessible, still hiding secrets. The question isn't whether the story is true, it's how much of the real story we still don't know. And based on what I found in those tunnels, we might not want to know the answer. Subscribe if you want to see more of my investigations into suppressed historical sites. Because trust me, this is just the beginning. What I found in Scotland is part of something much larger, and the people trying to keep it buried are still very much around. Next month, I'm heading to investigate similar cave systems in Wales. If I don't post anything after that, well, you'll know why.